This is Audible Bleeding, the Vascular Surgery Podcast. We're here to help you keep your finger on the pulse.
And welcome to another episode of Audible Bleeding. Today we have Dr. Ben Starnes with us. Dr. Starnes is a professor and the chief of the Division of Vascular Surgery and vice chair of the Department of Surgery at University of Washington. He's received his undergraduate at Albright College in Reading, Pennsylvania, and went to medical school at Jefferson Medical College in Philadelphia, and he completed his surgical training at the Walter Reed Medical Center in Washington, D.C. Prior to accepting his position at the University of Washington Medicine, he spent a total of 15 years in the United States Army, including 3 combat tours, 1 in Kosovo and 2 in Iraq, which we'll talk to him about a little bit today. His current research activities include a focus on multi-branched and fenestrated endografting of complex aortic disease, vascular trauma, and then studying some of the factors that influence outcomes in patients presenting with ruptured aortic aneurysms. He's a principal investigator on multiple clinical trials. He's published over 90 peer-reviewed publications and written multiple book chapters. He's very active in many vascular societies, including a past president of the Pacific Northwest Vascular Society and now the president-elect of the Western Vascular Society. And then finally, as both an accomplishment and a disclaimer, we should mention that Dr. Starnes is the co-founder of Aortica Corporation. Welcome, Dr. Starnes.
Thank you, Matt. It's good to be here.
Can you just start us off? What inspired you to go into vascular surgery? I heard it was a very early inspiration for you.
Yeah, it's a funny story. If you go back to my high school yearbook, next to my name with this cheesy little mustache, it says future plans, peripheral vascular surgery. And that was at the age of 17. And you might wonder, well, how the hell did I know I wanted to do vascular surgery? Well, my mother was an elementary school teacher, and she taught with a woman by the name of Marge Lanahan. And Marge was married to Dick Lanahan, who is now passed away, but he was a vascular surgeon, and he inspired me because whenever they would come over to our house for dinner, he kind of mentored me and helped shape my thoughts about what it took to be a surgeon. And he actually invited me to breakfast on a Sunday morning to talk about the cardiovascular system. This is when I was like 15 years old. So really a positive influence over me.
That's some intense breakfast conversation.
That's right. It's funny because he asked me to write a report on the cardiovascular system. And I said, now this is my chance. This is my chance. As if he had some kind of influence over my future. And so I spent a ton of time writing this report. And then when we went to breakfast and sat down to talk, we talked about everything but the cardiovascular system. So he just kind of put it to the side and we talked about everything else in life. So really a tremendous person.
Hi, Dr. Starnes. This is Nicole. That's really a great story. Was he involved in your career or your training as a doctor, or were there other people that came into that role later as mentors for you?
Oh yeah, so I would say that my biggest mentor in life was my father. He died in 2002, but he pretty much laid the foundation for the person that I am today. I had many other mentors along the way. Dick Lanahan was very early on, and I kept in touch with him throughout the years and would see him once in a while when I visited my parents. But other mentors included Dave Jakes at Walter Reed. He was my program director. Carlos Pellegrini, who was my boss here at the University of Washington. The late Roy Greenberg, Bruce Gewirtz, Frank Veith. I mean, I could name, a ton of different mentors, but I would say that every successful person doesn't just have one mentor. There are so many people that help shape a career.
What about on the other side of that, Dr. Starnes? Now that you're division chief, what do you look for when hiring a new faculty member?
That's an important topic. Today we have people that come from a generation that's different than my generation. And what I look for in particular in a junior faculty member is the energy, the drive, and the passion for vascular surgery. And that is pretty evident when you interview someone, how passionate they are about vascular surgery. If they start asking about, how much time am I going to get off, and how much am I going to be on call? Those are kind of red flags to me for someone who really isn't looking to work hard and to really put in the work that's required to become a superb technical vascular surgeon.
Fantastic. This is Kevin, and I'm also in the Army and looking forward to getting back to the Army in the next year and a half here. And I know you had a long, distinguished career. Can you tell us kind of some of the takeaways from your military experience and how it affects your practice in vascular today?
Kevin, that's a great topic to talk about, because I think what the military does is they create great leaders. I've come to know some of the best leaders have been born from the military and military training. And I think what the military does in particular is they teach humility. And what you learn, especially as a surgeon, is that you're not that special. You know, we all like to think we're special, but what the military really kind of jams down your throat is that you are not special. It's the mission that's the most important. And we can replace you. We can just get another one of you according to your MOS. That's the military occupational specialty. My MOS was a 61 whiskey. That's a vascular surgeon. But, you know, if I step on a landmine and get blown up, I mean, the mission goes on, and you have to replace the 61 whiskey with another 61 whiskey. So humility is probably the most important lesson you learn in the military, but also respect for others, showing up on time, being respectful of others, and how they contribute to the mission at hand.
Dr. Starnes, this is Sharif. So do you have any memorable cases from your military experience, either from a technical standpoint or from sort of an emotional standpoint, things that really stuck out in your experience, in your memory?
Well, Sharif, you know, being in combat, performing surgery in austere conditions is like trauma. It's what my friend Nitin Singh says, trauma on steroids. I mean, we see high velocity gunshot wounds that you don't typically see in the civilian world. We see blast injuries, burns, IED explosions, just plain nastiness. Not too much in the way of torso injury, though, because I think of the body armor that we have nowadays. But I would say that probably the most memorable case that I did in Iraq in 2000, I think this was 2003, almost 15 years ago, was a case in one of the downtown hospitals called Azadi Hospital. I was doing a couple of cases with an Iraqi surgeon there, and a baby was born, and her name was Aya, A-Y-A-T, and that stands for proof of God, and which is kind of interesting and prophetic in a way. But she was born with a tracheoesophageal fistula, and I asked, I had a newborn baby girl at home, my daughter Jessica, at the same time, and I said, well, who would normally fix this TE fistula? And they said, well, we would normally send her to Baghdad, and they said that was impossible now. So this little girl was going to die without a repair. And so I took her to the operating room that afternoon, and I had done several tracheoesophageal fistula repairs with Dan Roby when I was when I was at Walter Reed. So I knew how to do the operation. But operating on a 2-hour-old infant in the middle of the war in Iraq was really memorable to me. And she's still alive to this day. I keep in touch with the surgeon that helped me with that case, and that was a memorable case.
That's sort of an amazing story. I mean, we don't necessarily hear about it so much, about the involvement in the care of civilians and sort of doing things outside of your training, like not simply vascular surgery. Was that a big part of your responsibility over there?
Yeah, we're not prepared. When we go into a combat scenario, we're thinking about taking care of taking care of soldiers. But really what you wind up doing a lot of is taking care of the local nationals. I mean, there are little kids that run along the side of the road that get hit by cars, and you wind up, you find out that you're not prepared to take care of the pediatric trauma that goes on during wartime. And, to include not having endotracheal tubes that are small enough for kids. And so that's kind of a stark reality. But, after the war is matured for a little bit and the theater's matured, then, you figure out how to take care of kids.
You mentioned you still have contact with the surgeon you work with?
His name was Nadim Ibrahim. And it was funny because he smoked like a chimney. And he smoked in the operating room. We would finish cases in the operating room, and he would light up his cigarette and start flicking the ashes on the operating room floor.
That's not that uncommon in the Middle East.
And I'm looking at the oxygen tanks in the corner, and I'm saying, don't get too close to that oxygen tank over there. Anyway, Nadim is a good friend. He's now married. He has kids. I keep in touch with him. I invited him over to spend a month with me at Harborview Medical Center. And he came over. I had one of the industry companies, Cook Incorporated, sponsored him to come. And he learned a lot of the endovascular tricks that we were doing at the time, and really had an amazing experience. But that's a relationship that I've maintained over the past 15 years.
Dr. Starnes, is there anything you learned during your military experience over there, tips or tricks that you use to stay out of trouble or get yourself out of trouble in the OR today?
That's a great question. I did learn a lot of tips and tricks, just efficiency. And what you learn in those scenarios is how to become very efficient, how to operate with yourself, how to slow down. It's interesting. People think of a fast surgeon as being someone who's very quick or very slick with their hands. It's not that at all. It's being efficient and slowing down and taking, a bite with your suture perfectly every single time. And that shortens the operation considerably. Instead of doing something half-assed and then having to repair it, with multiple other sutures or multiple other techniques. What you learn is to just kind of get into that flow state where you just slow down, and it actually speeds the operation up tremendously.
And you said that you had fewer resources than you used to having. So was the setup that it would be you and a scrub tech, or who would be there with you usually?
So we operated in one operating room. I was with the 250th Forward Surgical Team when I was in Iraq. Back in 1999, I was with the last MASH, the 212th Mobile Army Surgical Hospital. That was the last MASH before the Army mothballed that concept and moved to an FST, that's a Forward Surgical Team, and Combat Support Hospital scenario. So in our FST, we had 3 DRASH tents. We had one tent that was an emergency room. We had one tent that was an OR, and one tent that was an ICU. And so in that operating room tent, it was a very enclosed space, probably about, I'd say, 500 square feet, not much space at all. But we had 2 operating room beds that were placed head to head so that the anesthesiologist could be in the center and give anesthesia to both patients, two simultaneous patients at the same time. And we had these OR lights that were about the size of a coffee cup, and they got really intensely hot. That's the other thing, is that people don't really talk about the conditions that you're in when you're deployed to a place like Iraq. It's incredibly hot. Even though we had air conditioning in the tent, it was still about 95 degrees inside that tent, where it was 120 outside. And so we operated with no clothes except for our underwear under our gowns, and because it was just so incredibly hot. Those operating room lights would become even more hot, and if they touched the back of your neck, they would actually cause burns on your skin. We had blood products that we could administer. We we operated whenever we needed to. We would perform simultaneous surgeries. We did that on multiple occasions. I haven't met too many surgeons, modern surgeons, who have operated on 2 humans in the same room at the same time. And that can be a little bit stressful, but it can also, do the right thing for the person.
Communicating in that setting must be challenging, just because when you're focused on one patient, it can get a little hectic, and there's probably a lot of crosstalk. Like, how do you guys make sure that the communication is clear in that setting?
Yeah, so we try to keep the communication to a minimum, and everybody just kind of does their job, and the surgeon really runs the show. The other thing that people don't talk about is, in a country like Iraq, they have loudspeakers throughout the city, and they have prayers that are chanted over these loudspeakers 5 times a day. And so that's also an unusual scenario, to be in an operating room where you're hearing prayers chanted. And I think communication is important. And I was involved in a project down at Cedars-Sinai with Bruce Gewirtz, who I mentioned earlier, and it was a study that was funded by the NIH looking at flow disruptions in surgery. How often does a surgeon get disrupted from doing their operation by either a pager going off or somebody coming up and asking a question, or, how can we minimize flow disruptions? And my input was fairly significant, because being in a situation like that is the ultimate in flow disruption. You've got so many distractions. You can hear explosions in the background. You can hear gunshots in the background often, and it is an environment that is one where you have to kind of focus and focus on the mission at hand and your communication skills.
Those are quite harrowing experiences, Dr. Starnes. And one of my good friends and colleagues, Jason Bingham, just got back from Syria last summer, and he discussed many of his experiences, especially with a fresh 18-year-old scrub tech straight out of military scrub tech school as your assistant, and it's just you and them kind of trying to take care of patients. But it's quite an experience. Dr. Starnes, we wanted to pivot a little bit. Part of the reason we brought you on Audible Bleeding today is you have many successful tracks that you've led throughout your career, but we kind of want to dive a little bit into the entrepreneurship track. It's not as widely pursued, but quite a productive one. And can you just tell us a little bit about what led you down this path, and how important it is to protect your own ideas?
Yeah. So you're talking about Aortica Corporation, which was founded in September of 2014. And that came from an idea. I've been involved in fenestrated endografting for a long time, dating back to 2007, so about 12 years. And I was asked by one of the industries that champions fenestrated endografting to conduct a course. So this was back in 2009 or 2010, I think. And so we had a couple of cases on the books, and they were both 3-vessel fenestrated cases. So we were incorporating the SMA in both renal arteries in each case. And I had about 9 or 10 physicians from all over the country come to our conference room. We have a pretty unique setup at Harborview. And we did 2 3-vessel fenestrated cases. We were done by 12:30. And they went very smoothly, very efficiently. And I walked up into the room, and there was just this electricity in the room. Everybody was so excited about fenestrated endografting. And they said, I can't wait to get this technology in my hands. I mean, that looks so simple. And then I said, well, now we're going to go into the planning. And we spent another day and a half talking about planning and how important it was to do manual centerline manipulation and all of these different tips and tricks for sizing an endograft. And I could see the eyes of these guys just start to go cold. They just realized that this was something that they did not want to embark upon because it was too difficult. It was too subjective and too difficult to plan these cases. Because I said, if the case is planned perfectly, the case is going to go in an hour and 15 minutes or an hour and a half. But if it's planned inappropriately, it's going to be a long day. It's going to take 6, 7, 8 hours to do this case. And that's not good for the patient. These elderly patients that can't afford to be on an operating table for more than 3 or 4 hours with large sheaths in their femoral arteries. So I had this idea that we just needed to make the planning easier. And if we could do that, if we could accomplish that goal and make it automated, then we could provide this technology to more patients and make it applicable to more patients to get the right operation. And so we started off by 3D printing some aortas of patients and using those as models for the endograft. Very simple concept. We patented this idea, this methodology patent, and the next step was to get money. And I have a next door neighbor by the name of Chad Robbins, who's the CEO of Adaptive Biotechnologies. He's a superstar who trained at Wharton Business School and super smart. He had just had some great news with his company. He had made his investors a lot of money, and he came to me. We were just running on we have these stairs at the end of our neighborhood that are pretty difficult to run up and down. And we were exercising one day, and I told him about this idea, and he said, "Do you mind if I come and take a look at that?" So I brought him into Harborview. He looked at it, and he said, I just made a lot of money for some of my investors. I think that if you and I start a company, this could be big. And so he brought his investors in to see this technology. We wanted to raise $2 million to start the company, and we were oversubscribed. People were so enthusiastic about this idea that we raised $7.2 million and started Aortica on September 14th, 2014. And the rest is history. I mean, we hired software with that money. We hired a CEO. We had to get all the legal stuff done. We had to get the licensing agreement from the University of Washington accomplished. And we hired software engineers. We hired mechanical engineers, and Aortica became a full-fledged company. And right now we're in the process of partnering with larger industry players to develop a fenestrated platform. So it's exciting. It's fun. It kind of is in alignment with everything that I do on a daily basis, with my research, with the patients that I see, and it's all I learned this on the fly. I didn't come out of medical school with the intent on being an entrepreneur. It just kind of fell into place along the way.
So, Dr. Starnes, what you're describing to us is like the process of seeing something, having an idea of how to make that process better, and then actually like taking the steps to bring this product to market. Do you have any tips that you learned during that process that you could share with other, young vascular surgeons who would like to do something similar?
Yeah. So every institution has some sort of company or some sort of tech transfer office. At the University of Washington, it's called CoMotion. It used to be called C4C, or the Center for Commercialization, but it's in the best interest of every institution to commercialize intellectual property. It's going to provide jobs. It's going to provide capital. And so if you're interested in developing an idea, the first thing you need to do is what's called an ROI. Go online and fill out a record of invention. And what that is it's a description of your idea. And the patent office, the U.S. Patent Office now has something that's called first to file. It's no longer, intellectual property if you have a patent on something. It's if you file the idea first, if you can prove that you filed the idea first. So the first thing you do is document your record of invention, and that could even be just writing it down in a book and having it date stamped, or sending an email to someone with the idea. But typically, it's a record of invention. Then you want to work on patenting your idea. Once you've obtained a patent, you then want to protect that patent with a suite of patents or sub-patents that tend to strengthen each aspect of the parent patent. And again, I didn't know any of this stuff when I first started, but it's something that I've learned along the way. And then that is what creates value in the company, is the intellectual property and how tight that intellectual property is. In the vascular space, it's sometimes difficult because there are predicate devices like stents that have been developed. If you want to develop a new stent, you have to file for what's called freedom to operate. And typically that's given to you, but the patent is not as strong. But you should have freedom to operate and to create a new stent that achieves a different purpose. But yeah, the whole thing about patents and the U.S. Patent Office and the FDA and navigating all of those things, it can be quite onerous. But if you get the right people on your team that have the knowledge of how to navigate those systems, it becomes quite easy.
And is this something that the University of Washington helped you out with a lot, or was this something that your partner helped you with more?
Well, it was mostly the University of Washington. Like I said, it's in their best interest to commercialize intellectual property. And so you develop the idea within the University of Washington, but then in order to start the company has to negotiate with the University of Washington. So once we set up the idea for the company, everything relied upon the agreement with the University of Washington. We couldn't go anywhere until we licensed that technology away from the University of Washington with exclusive rights. And so that's a process of negotiation. It involves attorneys. And once we negotiated that agreement, the company was born. And, the company would pay the University of Washington royalties on an annual basis. And that's a percentage of the company. So if the company sells eventually, the University of Washington is a shareholder, and they would receive, between 3 and 5% of the value of the company. Again, that's all negotiated ahead of time.
Since this is both a device and a planning platform, like what kind of liability do you have? It's a little bit different than just making a stent graft. Like you're also saying that you provide the planning and the sizing and the fenestrations for the customers of your platform.
Oh, that's a great question. You're getting it a little bit into the weeds. But what happens right now is that when you size an endograft, you order the fenestrated endograft, and you have to sign that sheet. You as the physician, it's almost like a prescription.
Signs off on it.
Yeah. So you have to sign off on the final plan. So what we would do is, the planning software is not, it's not an FDA approved software. It's part of the manufacturing process. So if a company like Medtronic or Terumo or Cook use this software, they would make that as part of their manufacturing process at the end of the manufacturing line. And the physician would merely sign off on it, on the plan being acceptable or not.
So the implanting physician is still ultimately responsible for
That's correct.
Signing off on this. I see. Okay.
That's correct. Yep.
So Dr. Starnes, there's a lot of talk about the fenestrated endovascular devices, and we just had a great talk with Dr. Oderich, another pioneer in this field, on our last podcast. How do you envision the future of fenestrated endovascular technology being distributed throughout the community centers, or is this going to be localized at the major academic centers? What do you foresee happening?
I think it's going to become mainstream, just like endovascular aneurysm repair became mainstream and went out into the community hospitals. Because, we had this conversation 20 years ago when EVAR was first coming out. At first, it was at the major university hospitals, not the community-based hospitals. But what happened was a period of evolution. And what that entailed was people like Gustavo Oderich training at a place like the Mayo Clinic and learning from people like Roy Greenberg. And like I did. I trained under Roy Greenberg in 2001. And and then going out and actually kind of disseminating that technology into the marketplace. And, right now I graduate one fellow and one resident every year, and they each have probably between 40 and 50 fenestrated endografts. So to them, an EVAR is just a simple procedure, and a fenestrated EVAR is just a standard procedure. So some of our graduates have gone out, like Ty Garland has gone out to Denver, and he has a very strong, robust fenestrated program. He's doing, maybe 12 to 15 cases a year, which that's one a month, and I think that's acceptable. I do think that there is going to be regionalization of some of this technology to some of the larger academic centers, but I think fenestrated endografting is here to stay, and for those who are being trained in it right now, it's going to become, just standard workflow.
Where do you think the next step with this is? In this, right now as fellows, we kind of joke that it's almost sad that we never get to see a simple EVAR anymore. That and quick thing. There are all these complex cases. Do you think the fenestrated EVARs are moving that way? And then what's going to be left for the big centers?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's always something in the pipeline. I think that some of the new technologies, we are at a pace right now of innovation that is unprecedented. I mean, the 5G technology that's coming is going to dramatically change medical imaging and the transfer of information. Bioabsorbable technology and drug-eluting stent grafts are on the horizon. New biomaterials, even 3D printing of blood vessels and organs like kidneys and livers for liver transplants. That's all on the horizon right now. So I think those are some of the new exciting techniques and technologies that are out there. And there's always going to be business. I mean, for you guys, I would say you have the ultimate job security. We are at a point right now in 2019 where over the next 11 years, by 2030, the number of people in the United States over the age of 65 is going to double from 36 million to 72 million people. That is, that's going to result in a lot of patients with vascular disease, and we don't have enough specialists to take care of it. Patients are living longer with cancer diagnoses. Patients that develop lung cancer. It used to be that stage 3 or stage 4 lung cancer was a death sentence, and those patients would only live 3 to 6 months at most. Now, patients with stage 3 and stage 4 lung cancer are living decades with better cancer therapies. So they're living long enough to develop vascular disease, and we are going to provide minimally invasive technologies to treat that vascular disease. So it's resulting in an explosion of this specialty. And so you guys have ultimate job security, no matter what, for at least the next 12 to 15 years.
So, Dr. Starnes, you mentioned one of your trainees has gone off and started a fenestrated program of his own. And I know that Andy Shanzer always gives you a lot of credit because he said he went to you and learned about the IDE process for physician-modified devices and really doing these sort of in an ethically rigorous fashion and looking at results closely. What do you think is the role for physician-modified devices? Should they all be done under IDE? What are your thoughts on that question?
Yeah, I think they should. I mean, that's the responsible way to do it, and it's the legal way to do it, so that you're not experimenting or kind of learning after each case. What we did was, I had done, I think, 87 or 90 physician-modified endografts, and we had published our results on the first 54 or 55 cases, and then someone at CMS flagged one of my operative notes and said that they weren't going to reimburse for that particular case. And that got the attention of the hospital administration. And so all of a sudden I was in a position where I could no longer do these cases unless I had the direct permission of the hospital leadership to do them, because we weren't being reimbursed for them. CMS was saying, essentially, I went and talked to the director at our carrier, Noridian, and she was very enthusiastic about what we were doing, but she said, this is experimental. This is not standard of care, and so we're not going to reimburse for it. And they said, you need to go get an IDE, and then we'll reimburse for every single case. So in 2009, it was a year of depression for me, because I thought to myself, how will the FDA ever agree to have me modify a commercially available graft to implant into a human? They're never going to let me do it. And so I spent a year writing this IDE, and I submitted it to the FDA. And then I got a call one day from Dorothy Abel, and she said, there's a lot of talk around the FDA today about how rare this is, but you have unconditional approval. This is one of the best IDEs we've ever seen at the FDA. And you have unconditional approval to start your IDE. And after I picked my jaw up off the floor, we got to work. And I'll tell you, it's been a great learning process, and everything has been reported to the FDA. And we've got just incredible results. We've developed new technologies. We're, incorporating new platforms into our IDE every day. The problem is that IDEs were, they were kind of, you had to have filed your IDE before January of 2015, or else you weren't going to be allowed to do early feasibility studies. CMS was not going to reimburse for early feasibility studies anymore. And so what position I think that's put us in now is that people that hold IDEs, like myself, like Andy Schanzer, like Gustavo Oderich, we are going to have to make these IDEs multi-center. And we can do that. We have to be very careful. We have to make sure that the results are going to be good, and that you're not going to have someone who doesn't know what they're doing implanting some of these new technologies. But I think we need to push to make these IDEs that have been grandfathered in multi-center, so that more centers can participate and the data can be collected in a rigorous fashion.
Do you think with with this expansion of people being able to do this, at more and more centers that are becoming smaller and smaller, is the physician modified graft, or just the fenestrated graft, is this becoming standard of care? Should we even still need IDEs in the near future?
I don't know. I talked with Roy Greenberg about this many years ago before he passed, and we talked about making a kit, some sort of kit that you could just apply fenestrations to a graft and kind of create the graft on the fly to fit each patient. And just the process of getting that through to FDA approval is really almost impossible, because it's so variable from patient to patient. I do think that physician modified is here. I think it's here to stay. Each location is different. The politics are different. But I think if you're trained at an institution where you have someone with an IDE, or you have someone who has a lot of experience with physician modified, I think it's perfectly okay to go ahead and do it.
Great. Well, thank you for this interesting discussion on entrepreneurship, and especially with the new documentary on Netflix titled The Bleeding Edge, and the media outcry over Theranos and Elizabeth Holmes. We know it's extremely important to be in compliance to prevent injury to patients, and we appreciate learning from you and how to do that. As we close, we just have a few kind of closing questions, and you kind of touched on this a little bit, but if you could just kind of narrow it down to either one trend or one technology. What is the most exciting thing that you see in the future of vascular surgery?
The most exciting thing, I would say it's the new biomaterials. I think that we're going to have materials that perform in a way that is equivalent with the tissues of the human body. I mentioned 3D printing of blood vessels and organs, but I think that instead of worrying about someone having vein for dialysis access, or someone having conduit for a distal bypass, we're going to be able to take the patient's blood cells and their stem cells and recreate a blood vessel for them and operate on them and replace their blood vessel with their blood vessel. I think that's exciting.
Dr. Starnes, this is a question that we like to ask everyone. It can be a little challenging. What is something that you believe to be true that few people would agree with you on?
You know, me being a proponent of fenestrated EVAR, I have said this multiple times, and I've had everyone disagree with me, everyone. But I think that anyone that presents with an abdominal aortic aneurysm I don't think they should get any type of standard EVAR technology. I think they should all get a fenestrated EVAR. Now, that's a pretty radical statement.
That is a controversial statement.
That is a controversial statement, but I'll tell you that we all know as vascular surgeons, I mean, even when we I come from an era where we did a ton of open surgery and a ton of open abdominal aortic aneurysm repairs. And you would look at the CT scan and you would see the neck, and it looked like a long, healthy neck. And you'd get in there and you'd clamp it, you'd transect the aortic neck right there, and it was always crappy. I mean, it always just kind of fell apart, and it was diseased, and it had thrombus in it, or it had calcification. And you'd go up above the renal arteries or above the renal vein, and that segment of the aorta was always healthy. It was always like calamari. It was like rubber and healthy. And I think that if you can take an endograft all the way up to the celiac every single time and be confident that you're going to preserve the blood flow into the SMA and the renal arteries, you're not only going to have a durable result, because these patients are going to live 10, 15, 20 years. You're not only going to have a durable result, but you're going to have dramatic aortic remodeling. I've seen it in my own practice, and the aneurysm disappears. It's a cure for this disease. They're not going to die of aneurysm rupture. And the rate of secondary interventions is also extremely low in my hands, in my practice. Yeah, we're seeing these standard EVARs fail. I mean, 10 years out, we're seeing new development of type 1A endoleaks.
So has that translated to your practice? So if you have someone who presents with a 2-centimeter neck and no thrombus, you would still put a fenestrated device in, or are you being selective?
No, I'd be very, very, I'd have a low threshold for doing a fenestrated EVAR on those patients.
Interesting.
You know, so if they have a 2-centimeter neck that's healthy, I'll offer it up to the patient. I'll say, listen, if they're 64 years old, I would definitely lean toward a fenestrated EVAR. If they're 84 years old, I'd put a standard endograft in them, because I don't expect that they're going to live another 5 or 10 years.
I have a much more controversial question to ask you next, but actually I have to follow up on that. If they're 64 years old, do you actually feel that those patients would still do better with a new fenestrated graft, or would you do the patient open?
Well, I always, if they have no comorbidities, I always offer them open repair. And I tell them what the morbidity and mortality statistics are. And I also bring up especially in a male, I bring up the concept of impotence and retrograde ejaculation. And most people prefer an endovascular repair, a minimally invasive repair. Even if you try and push them toward an open repair, they want to avoid the abdominal incision and the risk, even if it's a tiny risk, a remote risk of either impotence or retrograde ejaculation.
Well, on to the next most controversial question. There's a rumor that you listen to country music in the operating room.
Well, actually, it's not country music. I do love country music. I absolutely love country music. I grew up, my dad used to listen to Tom T. Hall and George Jones and Hank Williams, and I grew up listening to that music. And Charlie McCoy. I mean, Charlie McCoy was an unbelievable blues harp player. But my standing directive to the operating room staff is ABB. I listen to the Allman Brothers Pandora station, and that is the best Pandora station ever, because they not only play Allman Brothers music, but they play Stevie Ray Vaughan, they play Hound Dog Taylor. I mean, just really good blues. Just great fusion of kind of country music, but also of blues, and that's what I like the most.
Do you expect your trainee to be able to recognize the artist if quiz on it?
I do, and you've experienced that.
Very much.
Yeah, so I ask them. I mean, when I hear Eric Clapton or I hear somebody come on, I'll say like Led Zeppelin, Freebird, and I'll have a young trainee in the OR. I'll say, "Do you know who this is?" And they'll say, "No, I don't," and it just makes my heart sink.
Dr. Starnes, I hate to air dirty laundry, but Kevin may actually have to do some remediation because he has some difficulty identifying music in the OR, and it's been noted by the faculty. So,
pre-1990 music is beyond me. But
and then what about outside the operating room, Dr. Starnes? What do you like to do in your free time?
I love to play golf. I'm a big golf aficionado. So I belong at a country club, Glendale, in Bellevue, and I play at least once a week, every Sunday. I didn't play this Sunday morning because I had to go into the OR to do a popliteal thrombectomy, but love to play golf. I love to ride my Harley. I have a Road Glide Special that I've had for a number of years, and my brother is also a Harley aficionado, and he and I get together 2 or 3 times a year somewhere in the country and go on a nice long ride and just kind of get out and explore.
All right. Well, thank you very much for this interview. It's been very interesting. We're very happy to have you on Audible Bleeding.
It's been great to be here.
We are Audible Bleeding, the vascular surgery podcast. You can find us on social media at Audible Bleeding or online at audiblebleeding.com.